Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Creating Gender Inclusive Summer Programming. I am Ellen Gettinger, coming to you from JCC Association. We are happy to welcome our presenter, Daniel Bonner from Keshet. He will provide us with an hour of great learning today. JCC Association is pleased to continue our partnership with Keshet. This partnership not only gives JCCs more access to information about programs and content that Keshet provides, but it helps strengthen our Jewish community by showing a commitment to being welcoming and open to all. Just a couple of housekeeping before we start. Please move any coffee cups, any kind of lunch away from the keyboard. We might ask you to type in some answers to questions, and we don't want you knocking those over. You're going to be muted by the system. If you're on via phone, please don't put it on hold because then we might be hearing your hold music. Before we get started, I just want to go over some of the controls, and I want to make sure that you're comfortable with the dashboard. On the right, you will see an area where you can type answers to questions when our presenter asks, and there's also a raise your hand button that can allow you to be called on if our presenter asks you to do so. I'd like to introduce Daniel. He is the National Director of Education and Training with Keshet. Daniel Bonner works with Jewish communal organizations, and in particular, JCC Association. He works with organizations from around the country on strategies they can implement to become more inclusive of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer Jews in our communities. Daniel is coming to you from Boston, though he is an expat of the Midwest, having grown up in conservative synagogue in Cincinnati, Ohio. And now I'm going to turn it over to Daniel.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ellen, for that introduction, and thank you to JCCA for welcoming me to talk to all of you. I'm excited to continue the work that we've been doing for the past couple years, and especially I was at the recent professional convention a couple 2 months ago already. It's hard to believe. But excited to continue to do this work. And in talking to folks at the convention and since then, it became clear that as we got close to the summer that folks were really starting to become oriented to how do we make sure that the summer programming, when maybe there's a greater influx of individuals from our community, new community opportunities for new community members to participate in our programming, just to make sure that with these summer months and the focus on day camps, aquatic centers, fitness centers, kind of the whole life of the JCC that might become more alive with the summer, how do we make sure that those are welcoming and inclusive of LGBTQ individuals, in particular transgender, gender non-conforming, gender non-binary individuals. We are going to focus a little bit more on gender identity development, so you can actually hit to the next slide. Yep. So our goals today, we're going to talk a little bit about how gender operates in our society, talk a little bit about more on some theories on gender identity development, in particular focusing on young children, and try to better understand the process by which young folk come to terms or understand their own gender identity, because it is research that is newer and emerging, and it's something that we're going to have to contend with more and more. We'll just briefly go over some terms and concepts related to LGBTQ inclusion, just to make sure that we're on the same page, and even if you have been exposed to these terms before, I feel it's really important to keep refreshing our memory, especially if we're not using them a lot, but just to make sure we're always educating ourselves and pushing ourselves to be as mindful about language as possible. And then lastly, we'll spend the last chunk of time really talking about those concrete strategies that you all can implement to make your programs more inclusive. We should also have time to ask questions if you have specific incidences about things we didn't cover, or happy to talk offline too if there's something more nuanced or delicate that you would like to discuss. So with that, we can go to the next slide. So you can go ahead and click through. There's a couple animations. Yeah, great. Thank you. So just to build a shared language so we understand what it is that I'm talking about, for those of you that might be new to this conversation, and to refresh your memory if you have heard me talk about this before or others. So there are three main concepts that we need to understand when we're talking about LGBTQ inclusion, and in particular, inclusion of trans folks in our community. So the first of those is sex assigned at birth. You might also hear this as biological sex, but sex assigned at birth is the most affirmative way to describe it. And so what that actually is describing is people's bodies. So these would be primary and secondary sex characteristics, genitalia, chromosomes, hormone levels, body hair, all of those things. And we say assigned at birth because what happens when we're born, kind of circle of life symbol moment, is the doctor will look at our bodies and based on the cues that they're getting, to assign us male, female, intersex. And those are the words that are associated with sex assigned at birth: male, female, intersex. Again, words about bodies. That is then distinct but somewhat related to the concept of gender identity. So gender identity is our internal sense of who we are in relationship to society, norms, expectations, things like that. It is distinct from one sex assigned at birth, but it is related. So words related to gender identity would be cisgender, transgender, man, woman, etc. We'll define some of those later for folks. But again, it's this internal sense of who we are. It's a very deeply embedded understanding of who we are. It's very foundational to who we are and how we navigate the world. And then lastly, orientation then is really talking about our attractions and who we fall in love with, who we want to be in a relationship with. These three are all distinct from each other. Just because you know one does not mean you can assume the others. Our society is structured in a way that we are socialized to do that. We're socialized to look at somebody, and if they're giving us cues that are masculine, to assume that they are a man, therefore have a male body, and are therefore going to be attracted to women. And that is called heteronormativity, so assuming that everybody is heterosexual, and cisnormativity, assuming that everybody is cisgender. Those practices are really the barriers that are keeping our programs from being fully inclusive, and that's what we're going to talk about, is how can we start to take those steps that are right for our community to make sure that we're breaking down those heteronormative and cisnormative modalities of thinking. It's not to remove the concept of heterosexuality or the concept of a cisgender experience, but just to recognize that there are lots of human experiences, there are many diverse, and all of them are welcome and seen in our community. You can go to the next slide. So again, that's just a refresher for this will be made available to you. So if you need those words, again, sex, gender, identity, and orientation. So you can go to the next slide. So now, before I get into some of the terms, I want to talk about gender specifically and really get into some of the research that is starting to develop around what do young people know in our communities. I think something that you're seeing in JCCs and day schools and all walks of Jewish communal life is that as I'm part of the millennial generation, as millennial generations more likely than not, and older generations too, but more often my generation who is starting to have children, and we are as a age cohort challenging gender norms as a whole, it's not a matter of there's been an influx in young people identifying as trans or gender conforming that never existed before. What's changing is that these behaviors that have already, these identities and behaviors and understandings of ourselves have always been there, but what has happened before is that there is enough societal pressure from parents, families, peers, authority figures that young people really learned that it wasn't okay to be trans or gender nonconforming or whatnot, and so they hid it and it wasn't an issue. What now you're seeing is as there's a greater push for accepting people, including people, greater understanding of what the queer experience is, you're seeing more and more adults with young children who are expecting that the spaces in which their children are in are going to be inclusive if they are expressing gender nonconformity or trans identity, things like that, or other identities, genderqueer, non-binary, whatnot. The expectation is that we are listening to our young people and that our spaces that they're going to be in need to reflect their realities rather than the young person kind of going the reverse and having to fit into this strict structure of the community. So that's what I want to do now is really get down into what does it mean for children to understand their gender. Because I think for those of us, and I identify as cisgender, so I identify as a cisgender gay man, which means that my gender identity is in line with what I was assigned at birth. So when I was born, the doctor saw male genitalia, I said, it's a boy. And as I came to know myself, I never questioned that. And that experience is called cisgender. Cis, C-I-S, is a Latin prefix that means on the same side. So literally my gender is on the same side of that which I was assigned at birth, which would then contrast with transgender of your gender identity is different than what you were assigned at birth. And so for those of us that have a cisgender experience and our experience is reflected and supported at large by society, we never think about we have the privilege of not thinking about our gender identity. and what it would be like and feel like to be different. And so because we don't have that experience, it can be somewhat challenging for folks to understand when a young trans person is talking to you and they're explaining their experience to you, like, well, I don't understand how you can know that. Well, I would turn it back on us as cis folk and say, when do we remember that we were a boy or a girl, right? So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit. And so this research is from Dr. Patrick Rock from the Youth and Gender Media Project. He's a trans educator out in Los Angeles, who we've done some work with, but he also got his doctorate in social psychology. And so this is kind of the new and emerging field of gender identity development. So when we really look at it, infants develop gender categories, so male, female, by 6 to 9 months. So when they hear a man's voice, or they preferentially will look to a man's face over a woman's face. This is not a mature understanding of what these categories mean, but rather just an early recognition of patterns in their environment. And when you think about it, that's what young humans are supposed to do. We, as babies, are learning how to organize the world and how to see the world, how to navigate it, even when we don't have words to describe it. But we're starting to recognize patterns. And the patterns that we're recognizing are patterns not because they are some ingrained biological component, but rather that this human child is operating within the construct of human society and is picking up the patterns that have been socially constructed for them, right? So just because their infants divide these categories does not mean that, oh, it's only gender binary and that's it. So then by age 2, toddlers have learned rudimentary gender stereotypes. So they've already picked up on mismatches. So if an image of a man putting on lipstick or identifying boys' toys or girls' toys according to typical social norms. And then by preschool, children start to avoid peers who violate gender norms. And again, this isn't, I cannot stress enough, this is not because it's this some chromosomal DNA imprint that they understand the world, but they're picking up on the patterns of how we as adults structure the world and that they're learning to navigate. And they're already picking up from a young age by the messages that they're getting that when you cross these boundaries, that there is a social cost to them, right? So by preschool, think about it. By age 4, 5, children are starting to avoid peers who violate gender norms. So think about that. So for me, thinking what that means for my own story, so even though I identify as a cisgender gay man, I was always a more effeminate sissy boy, and I was called slurs from a really young age that were slurs designated for boys that were more effeminate, like I was called the F word before any of us knew what it meant, other than that it's a word to throw against somebody that doesn't conform to some gender norms. And that started at a really young age. And so that's why it's so critical that from a really young age we're sending these messages of inclusion and welcoming, because if those are the patterns and the way of organizing the world that we are raising our children in, they're going to understand and structure the world in the same way, not reflect back some other understanding. So that's why it's so important to really start early in breaking down these boys and girl dichotomy, the gender binary. So you can go to the next slide. So when do children develop a gender identity on their own? So then children will start to label themselves, i.e. as a boy or a girl, again, because those are the options that society at large will give them, between 2 and 3 years of age. And then between 3 and 4, there's this concept of gender stability. Children learn that they're taught that gender is stable, that a girl will not grow up to be a man and vice versa, again, because this is the way the gender binary is structured. And so they're understanding that there is these boundaries that people typically, or society says they're not supposed to cross. And then gender constancy. So between 5 and 7 years old, children learn that gender is consistent across situations, that a boy does not become a girl by putting on a dress, or a girl does not become a boy by putting on pants. So then over the course of early childhood, what we see is that children seek out information about what being a boy or a girl means. So they look to same-sex role models, to media images, to books, to teachers, to peers, right? So they're just absorbing all of this information about what does it mean to be who I am. And it's already deeply starting to impact who they are in their sense of the world. So next slide. So then what sort of gender variability is common in children? And so this is getting at the questions that sometimes arise when young children are, typically I think what happens more often than not is it's a little boy, somebody that's raised as a little boy who likes to play dress up or play with Barbies or kind of girly things, right? And so those would be those children like me, who I like to play dress up, play with Barbies. Some children just naturally engage in play or hobbies that are not normative for their gender group. Some children then are perceived as gender non-conforming in the way they walk, speak, or play. Some children engage in pretend play in which they take on the role of a different gendered character. Some children show delay in development of gender concepts, but research largely shows that these children who engage in the above gender atypical behavior reveal that the vast majority of those children do not grow up to identify as trans, right? So that's something I really want to stress, especially as you're thinking about your early childhood programs or just any kind of programming where young children are at. Just because a young person is breaking gender norms does not mean you have to then go all the way down to their identifies a trans child. It very might well be what's going on, but it's not something that you need to make that automatic step, nor kind of put like red flags up or something, because there's nothing really to put red flags up about. It's just this kid living his life in this case. So what instead it is, it's about creating environments where kids and young people feel supported in doing whatever feels good, whatever brings them joy, rather than putting them into a box about what's okay or what's not okay. So you can hit the next slide. So then what does it mean to be a trans youth, right? So these would be the signs that you'd be looking for to cue you in that this might be the experience that this child is having. So a child is considered transgender if they express a consistent, persistent, and insistent gender identity that does not align with their assigned sex at birth. So what does this mean? So consistent means that the child reliably claims the same gender identity. So that means they're consistently identifying as a girl, let's say. They're persistent, so these expressions of gender identity continue over considerable time in the child's life, so 6+ months, right? So it goes on for a while, regardless of maybe what the parents are saying, supportive or lightly supportive or pushing back, but it's a persistent kind of claim. It's not this like offhanded, I'm playing and I'm playing dress up and I'm saying I'm a girl and one off, but it's really this persistent. And then lastly, it's this insistent. The child expresses their true gender identity resolutely or intensely, and this is where you might start seeing some emotions undergirding their actions or how they react. So you might see that really intense emotional reactions. Because again, this is a young person who knows these things about themselves and are trying to tell the adults in their lives, and the adults in their lives are not listening. And we all know what that feels like when people just don't listen to us, and we tell somebody over and over again, and they still refuse to listen. That feels really crappy a lot of the time. So it's these youth who express these characteristics. They often grow up to be trans adults. But at the same time, many trans adults do not meet these criteria as children. Why? It goes to about what I was saying earlier of when people that are adults now would have been going through this, our society had a very different receptibility to trans visibility, to accepting trans folks. So they might have been going through some of these internally, but they might not have met these criteria in their day-to-day lives because the social cost to vocalize it would be too high, right? So that is what you should be looking for then when we're talking about trans youth. And you can go to the next slide. Actually, can you go back one before we get there? Yeah, great, thanks. And something to keep in mind, because I focused on trans youth because I wanted to focus on that, but I also just wanted to lift up as well that the experiences for trans teens is also something that's really important to recognize, because that's when you start getting into some other areas around kind of puberty and dating and exploring sexuality and in a healthy and safe way that have a lot of other nuances that I don't have the time to get into now, but if that's something that folks are interested in learning about, I'm happy to talk more about that offline or one-on-one. But one thing that I will say is that LGBTQ individuals, and particularly LGBTQ young people, are really at risk for a number of negative consequences for not being accepted fully in their communities. In particular, suicide ideation amongst LGBTQ young people is much higher than their heterosexual cisgender peers. So for LGBTQ young people in general, it's about, I think it's 40% have considered suicide, but for trans youth, it's about 50%. So 50% of all trans youth in our country, in our communities, have experienced such discrimination and feeling invisible or feeling not seen that they would consider ending their lives. So this is really about saving people's lives. I just can't stress it enough. Especially trans women of color are some of the most marginalized, is one of the most marginalized groups in our community at large. There's been a number of murders of trans women of color around the country since January. I think the publicized has been 7 or 8 by at this point. So we have a crisis in our communities around, including trans women of color, but trans folks in general. So before we pause and go on, I just want to stop here to see if anybody has any questions on anything we've covered so far. I know it was a little bit jargony, but I just want to pause and see if anybody has questions. So feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat box. So I'll just pause for like a minute or two. Any questions? Ellen, do we see any hands raised?
No, don't see anything.
Okay. Great, so you can go on to the next slide then. Great, so just lastly, just to quickly go over some terms that I've talked about, but just to really understand that as a young person is understanding who they are, these are some of the terms that they might be using to describe their experience. So the first would be transgender, as I said. It can be used as an umbrella term for anyone that knows themselves to be a gender that is different than the gender they were assigned at birth. Some trans folks have an alternate gender identity that is neither male nor female. For some people, their gender identity may vary at different points of their lives. Some trans folks modify their bodies through medical means, some do not. But some terms you might hear would be trans man, trans woman, trans boy, trans girl, or man or woman of transgender experience. And so like I said, trans is a Latin prefix that means to like cross boundaries. So your gender it's a cross or different than what you were assigned at birth, which again complements cisgender, so somebody who is comfortable and knows themselves to be the gender they were assigned at birth. As I said, it's a Latin prefix, cis, meaning on the same side. So gender nonconforming, pretty straightforward. It describes exactly what it sounds like. So it's a gender identity or expression or modalities of behavior for a gender identity used to describe people whose gender expression does not align with societal expectations based on their perceived gender. So when I was a young child and I liked to play dress up, I would have been a gender nonconforming kind of child. Then there's gender queer. So again, break up the word. So queering gender. So their gender identity used by a person that self-identifies their gender as queer, non-normative. Someone whose chosen gender identity is neither man nor woman, is between or beyond gender. They reject the gender binary, or some kind of combination of gender. And you'll have a better understanding about what that's talking about on my next slide. But lastly, non-binary, again, is an umbrella term for all genders other than man, woman, female, male. That's used as an adjective. Not all non-binary folks identify as trans. Not all trans people identify as non-binary. But it's just, again, know that this is an identity that young people might be using. So you can go to the next slide. And so lastly, just to kind of lock this in, some of you might have seen this, but this is the Gender Unicorn. This is a really great tool that you can use with your young people in your community, with your staff, with your larger community, about what does this mean. And so gender identity, like we said, is really central to who we are as people, represented by the rainbow in the head. And then gender expression, the green dotted line, green dots around it, how we express our gender. And you'll notice on this document, on this tool, that each of those are written as like spectrums or as vectors, and that's how you can understand genderqueer. So if we're having a spectrum of like on one side is like masculine or man, and the other side is female or woman, in the middle somewhere would be kind of genderqueer if you're thinking about this as a spectrum. And again, the DNA symbol would be genitalia, sex assigned at birth, and then the hearts would be attraction. And this is from transstudenteducationresources.org. They're a really great website if you're ever looking for other resources about identity. So you can go on to the next slide. And so now I want to switch gears, and now that we have about a half hour or so, to talk about what does this mean then? What does this mean to build inclusive summer program? And so I want to focus on 3 different areas, because institutional change can be overwhelming at times. It can be a lot to think about. And so we break it up into program, policy, and culture. So go ahead to the next slide. So for programming, you'll see here on the screen this the boy, man, girl, woman. One thing that I think you should really start to consider is avoiding, at the times you can, of separating out programs based on boys and girls. That comes from really high up to how you structure your programs, to even low kind of informal activities that you might be doing at like a session of like all the boys line up, all the girls line up, or all the boys on one side, all the girls on the other side, right? If you do have to separate it by boys and girls, allowing the young people to determine and go into the group that's the most affirming to them considering having a third option group that's a non-gendered group that could be mixed for folks, because non-binary young people wouldn't really feel served in this kind of breakup. But really, it's just a matter of thinking about all the number of ways you could divide people up that are not based on boy and girl. You can do by birthday, you can do it by favorite animal, food, color, all kinds of other different configurations, right? So really thinking about the times that we separate kids out by gender, and also all the times that we force young people to think about their gender and declare their gender. That can just be a thought experiment for you to kind of help you navigate what they're feeling. But thinking about the spaces that you do this and taking and removing those and just adapting or changing them. So the next slide. So some other stuff you can consider. One thing, especially, I mean, it's next month, so maybe it might be more challenging to do some program, but around the country, June is known as LGBTQ Pride Month in many cities. Unless you're in warmer climates, then it's some other month because it's too hot. But something to consider is doing some kind of pride theme. So there are a lot of queer adults that have families with young children. That could be a group of people that you can target. There might be, I'm sure there are plenty of cisgender heterosexual adults that have queer kids that maybe want to come to an event. So maybe doing something with pride could be a fun way to engage with new people, either have some kind of event at your JCC or as part of your program area, or even considering JCCY doing something with your local city pride. And putting yourselves out there, I think, can be really a fun way to do that. There's a lot of fun cross-programmatic opportunities. In terms of other types of programs you could do when we're talking about athletic teams, there's no reason that a trans young person shouldn't be placed on the gender-affirming team. So that means that a trans boy who might have been assigned female at birth should be on the boys' team, and a trans girl who might have been assigned male at birth should be on the girls' team. It is a misconception, and it is false, that by allowing this to happen, that there would be it would break the competitive nature or create some kind of unfair situation, because already on the cisgender teams as they're structured, there's vast differences in human body size, weight, what they're able to carry, how fast people can run, hormone levels, and we don't, in kind of everyday intramural kind of situations, we don't really have really high-techy standards or anything, but there really is no reason why a trans young person shouldn't be on the team that is affirming of the gender identity. Again, we can talk more explicitly about this, but that is something you should consider. You should also consider, again, not having boys and girls teams completely and doing a gender-neutral, all-gendered teams, because that can just do so many other fun ways of playing sports and engage with people in different ways. If you have packing lists or bring these items to day camp or anything, avoid separating them by gender. Again, totally unnecessary. I know this maybe more happens in overnight situations, but there's no reason why you need to separate out by boys wear this and girls wear this for Shabbat, right? You can say these are appropriate attire for Shabbat services, or these are appropriate attire for swim time, or these are appropriate attire to use the fitness center. You don't need to gender it. And then having LGBTQ-friendly kids books, and we do have, I can provide you lists of books that speak explicitly on trans experiences, gender non-conforming experiences that are written for young children in like picture book form. There are plenty of them that exist that also speak to LGBTQ experiences too. So like the poem Superhero, it's a book about a kid with two dads, but it's actually a story about gender expression. There's The Flower Girl with Celery, where a little girl goes to her aunt's wedding to another woman. There's I Am Jazz, which is a story of a young trans girl. My Princess Boy, all kinds of other options. And so making sure you have these books in your library, or considering them if you have like story time or something for your young kids, consider having that as a book that you read together, or as an option for a book to read together. There's a lot of other programmatic ideas you could do depending on your age groups. At the end, I believe I have the link to the resource library that we can support you in that, but that's something I can also help with, of coming up with ideas for engaging with young people on these topics. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So then policy. Policy for me is a way that we codify our values, and it's also using values language as a way that we can handle pushback from people in our community. I think we are nervous about pushback, and we think that that is the loudest voices are going to be the ones that kind of speak up. But actually, in our experience, while that might happen, there are also the flip side where people are really excited that this is happening, and they say things like, "I'm so proud to send my child to a community that this is something that they value." And so one thing I would recommend is to really ground any communication or any policy changes you make in the values of your community. The values you have listed on your screen here come from a tool that we have at Kesha called 7 Values for an Inclusive Jewish Community. So they're kavod, respect, peace in the home, in God's image, communal responsibility, guarding one's use of language, love your neighbor as yourself, and solidarity. In our work, these values have been some would argue are very, they have to be present in order for a community to consider themselves Jewish. But in my experience, they really, and from my perspective, they really call upon us to build spaces that are inclusive. Because if we say we're a community that values respect, that means we have to pray with our feet and do that. We have to treat people the way that we want to be treated. If we believe that everybody is made in God's image, and thinking about the first time that humans are mentioned as being created in the Torah, and that first being had both male and female within them, and some rabbis understood that being to what they called androgynos, or intersex. So if we centered that story, how could that open up our communities to non-gender binary structures, right? So if we value these things, we need to do them. And you can use values language to really frame this conversation for your larger community. There might be values that you at your JCC or in your program really want to lift up that I'm sure they probably speak to inclusion as well, even if they don't at first blush. Excuse me. So you can go to the next slide. So this is just the reference from the Torah that I was talking about, the Talmud. For the first time humans are mentioned, and it's just an example of the rabbis understanding that that individual, the first human being, was actually created androgynous, so mixture male and female. So you can go. So again, it's just lifting up that this is something that has always existed in our tradition. It's not some modern creation that we're just doing. We as Jews have a history of including people and widening the tent. Because you'll see in the Talmud, if you dive deeper, that the rabbis had up to 5 different classifications and words for gender and sex as they described it, that go beyond just male and female, or man and woman. And each of those categories have different expectations associated with them. So again, it's just lifting up that it is actually very integral to our tradition to make space for people that have diverse experiences. So continuing on for policy, making sure that all policies includes protection from discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So what this includes would be anti-bullying language that you might have. So making sure that everybody knows that if you have anti-harassment, anti-bullying, that this is protecting people based on these identities. Equal opportunity employment as well, EEO policies, especially if you are a community that has an influx of college students maybe coming home for the summer, or high school students looking for jobs and they're seasonal employees. Young people are having these conversations, they're coming out at higher rates, that they're going to expect to be treated fairly and equally. And so making sure that those policies are in place too. Bathroom policies and changing rooms is one that is really hot topic. So the one on your screen here is an example from Asheville, North Carolina, JCC, that I've shared before. But you can see how easy it is to just kind of write this up. So as you see here, trans individuals should use the locker room, restroom of their choosing in all cases. Locker room facilities will be maintained by the JCC folks. And so what does it mean? What it means by their choosing, what it's actually saying is that trans folks should feel welcome to use the bathroom affirmative of their gender identity. That does not mean that you shouldn't also work to have an all-gender bathroom as well. Why that's important is that while the policy should be that trans folks use the bathroom affirmative of their gender identity, the reality is that they might not feel safe to do so because of their own past experiences of being excluded or targeted or harassed in a bathroom. That having an all-gender bathroom option makes sure that they know that there's a safe place for them to go to the bathroom if, let's say, they were walking in and somebody they've had a really negative experience with walked in right ahead of them and they just don't want to deal with it in that moment, and so they know they can go somewhere else. So it's important to have both the policy of allowing folks to use the space that is affirmative of who they are, but at the same time having that safe space that they are guaranteed to go by. If you don't have the money to build a new bathroom, it could be as simple as converting your unisex family bathroom that might be handicap accessible and putting up a new sign that says all gender bathroom. It could be as simple as that with low cost. And again, with changing rooms, if you have communal spaces, in those, a low cost fix to that could be just put up a curtain that you could buy at Target, right? Just like a tension rod and a curtain, add some privacy that everybody can use, not just trans folks, because there are plenty of people, regardless of identity, who just, for whatever reason, don't feel comfortable changing in front of people, and they prefer privacy. So you can go ahead and switch to the next slide. And then lastly, culture. So culture is something how we interact. It's about the physical space. It's about how we interact with people. So what you'll see here is a visible marker of inclusion. And so in response to the administration's directives a couple of months ago, removing guidelines and protections for trans students in public schools, it's very important that trans young people really know that the Jewish community has their backs. And so we started a campaign called Kavod Akshav, Trans Jews Belong Here, that folks can sign on to. They can download the sign and put up on their windows, on the doors of their buildings, to let people know explicitly that trans Jews belong here. And that explicit nature of this conversation is really important. As we saw last week with the executive order that was signed under the guise of religious liberty, the language around religion and faith is once again being used as a tool to discriminate against our community, when really all it's doing is putting a preference of one set of religious beliefs over others. And that's why it's really important that all faith communities explicitly come out and state that LGBTQ individuals belong here, and that our idea of being a religious community, a faith-based community, is one in which you are seen and welcomed fully. And so that's why these kinds of signs are really important. You can go to the next sign as well. And so other signs of inclusion like Safe Zone stickers or 7 Jewish values would be also important. But as we're talking about culture, something else that comes to mind is how we talk to each other. So here are some tips to avoid in terms of interpersonal relationships. So one, you can't tell if someone is trans just by looking at them. Don't make an assumption about a trans person's sexual orientation. Allow them to describe that to you and describe their experiences whenever they feel comfortable. If you don't know what pronouns to use, listen first. One thing you can start to do is when you introduce yourself to say your pronouns. So usually I forgot to do this, but typically what I do is I say, hi, my name is Daniel. My pronouns are he, him, and his. If you're not sure why we're doing it, pronouns are one of the most basic ways we show each other with respect. And since we're socialized to look at somebody and assume what pronouns to use, it's also one of the easiest ways to show trans folks disrespect. And so that's why it's important to start asking and declaring our pronouns so we don't have to make that assumption. You can put them on name tags, things like that. If you don't know what pronouns to use, maybe it's in conversation, listen first. Get cues from your peers, from people that know them, and go from there. Don't ask a trans person what their real name is. Some folks refer to the name as their dead name that they might have been assigned to them by their parents. It can be really painful to recount those experiences. And when you say, what's your real name, you're telling that person in front of you that you do not hold their identity as real and valid. So you should never ask that kind of a question. Allow people to describe their journeys to you on their time schedule, not on yours. Because understanding that there is a difference between coming out as lesbian, bisexual, or gay and coming out as trans. I think we've gotten to a place in our society at large where coming out as lesbian, gay, bisexual is greeted with affirmation, with celebration, with thank you so much for being your authentic self. But what happens sometimes when trans folks come out as with their trans identity is that they're actually sometimes seen by others that don't have a great grasp of what that means as being dishonest or as being more inauthentic, that they had been lying to them or being that it's some kind of dishonest stereotype that's associated with the trans community. And so that's why it's really dangerous to out trans people without their consent. You might have seen in the news a couple weeks ago, there was a episode of Survivor where a trans contestant was out, and it was a really big deal. And he wrote a really moving essay about that experience I would recommend reading if you're curious. But recognizing that it's really dangerous to out trans folks without their permission because of the dangers that they still face. Respecting the terminology a trans person uses to describe their identity. So the pronouns that they use, how they describe their identity to them, that's what you need to be using, not what you think is based on what you see or what is going to make your life easier. What we're asking is to treat the person in front of you with respect, and if that means taking an extra 30 seconds of mental energy to make sure you're using the right pronouns, I think it's worth it. Especially this next one is really important for those working with young people. Being patient with a person who's questioning or exploring their gender identity. Language changes rapidly. It's changed rapidly in the past 5 to 10 years around gender identity explicitly. There's going to be words that you hear that maybe you've never heard before, and that's okay. But what's more important instead is just to let that young person be on the journey that they're on and know that you are supportive of them and that they don't have to know where they are at any given time, but just to know that this community will hold them as they're on that journey. And kind of similarly, there's no right or wrong way to transition. It's different for every person. There's lots of different considerations, both financial pressures, barriers, societal barriers to changing documentation. So just know that there's no right or wrong way, and it's not a monolithic experience. You should never ask a trans person about their genitals, their surgical status, or their sex life. That's a very private experience, again, part of their journey. And then lastly, avoid backhanded compliments or helpful tips. Like, I could never have told that you were trans. That's not helpful and really offensive. So these are just some tips about how to engage with folks. I apologize if it seems very common sense basic, but in my experience, folks get tripped over this, when really it's just trusting your instincts on treating that person with dignity and respect, and apologizing when you make mistakes and moving on. For example, if you mispronounce somebody, you shouldn't make a big to-do about it. Instead of saying, oh my God, this is so hard, you need to give me time, that blah, 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 blah. Instead, just say, if you mispronounce somebody, say apologize, correct yourself, and move on. That's all you need to do. So you can go on to the next slide. And again, with language, especially working with young people, be really mindful of the conversations that they're having with each other. So as adults in those situations, you help set the tone. If you hear slurs related to somebody's sexual orientation or gender identity, even if you don't know, even if that person that's targeted doesn't identify with that way or you don't know, you need to address it in that moment. An appropriate response could be, in this community, we treat each other with respect, and that word is offensive or disrespectful. It's really important to make sure you follow up with both the target of the slur and the one who used it, probably separately. It might be the first time that the person that used the slur was challenged by it. They might not really understand what it means. Maybe it's just a word that they know to use to make somebody feel pain. So it's important to step up and be that adult in the space, because you could make a huge difference, and they might stop because this adult in their life told them it wasn't okay. So some inappropriate or offensive language related to sexual orientation and gender identity could include some of the words you see here. So the F word, T word, calling somebody he, she, or it, the D word, even saying that's so gay can be really offensive. But even statements like that's a girl thing, or she must be a lesbian because she plays softball. Those are gendered stereotypes that hurt all of us regardless of identity. And even assuming that all boys and girls have penises or vaginas would also be transphobic, because we know that's not true. So just avoiding those gendered generalizations is a really powerful thing that we can all start to do on our own to really challenge ourselves to make sure that we're not relying on these kinds of stereotypes. You can go to the next slide. So some other areas around culture, we've talked a little bit about visible markers, so Safe Zone stickers. With Pride coming up, that's something you could also do, is sign on to our Pride campaign. So we'll be sending out notifications about our Pride celebration resources from our website in the coming days. But when you do it, it'll take you to our website. You can add your organization, and what it'll do is it'll sign your JCC up as the Jewish. It'll be a part of our website that says the Jewish community is proud to celebrate LGBTQ Pride. So that's what that would do. Having statements of welcoming and inclusion could also be really important. Putting those on our website, putting on banners, putting rainbows on things. Those all send the cue that we are welcoming and inclusive. And it needs to be, again, explicit. We are welcoming and inclusive of all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, immigration status, socioeconomic, gender identity, sexual orientation, expression, etc. And then also to the forms that we use and the paperwork we use to kind of structure our communities, thinking about the times you ask gender and how do you ask gender. Is it necessary? This can be a really nuanced and complicated question. So if you have specific questions about what your forms could look like, I would ask you to email me, just because I don't want to get too deep in the weeds for folks, because I think folks will get overwhelmed. But in general, the best practice would be, if you do need to ask it, to leave it blank and let folks self-describe, rather than to force people to decide one of two options. But again, if you have specific questions about forms, you can email me directly. And so next slide. And lastly, there are a lot of resources that I didn't name here that you can find on our Kesha website. So keshaonline.org. If you go and you see the tabs on our homepage and you go to the resources tab, it'll take you to our resource library, where there's 677 entries of a variety of topics, holidays, authors, media types, grade levels. You can search it by all those different drop-down menus for lesson plans, activities, program ideas, all kinds of different things that you could bring into your communities for free. All we ask is you share that you got it from us. And I'm happy to walk you through the resource library if you have any questions or need any particular resources. But you can search by grade level. So if you're looking for things good for high school students or for young children, we do have various resources and lesson plans step-by-step, so you don't even have to create it from scratch. So next slide. And so with that, we have about 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes or so for people to ask questions. My email address is right there if you need to email me anything specific. That's our website. But I want to thank you again for having me and for sitting in on the webinar. So now I just want to turn it over for questions. So feel free to speak up, raise your hand, or type it into the box, or email me one-on-one if you would like. So let's turn over to questions.
Yes, so there was a question from Jen, and she asked, would you argue that the most inclusive approach would to not have gendered groups or teams at all?
Yeah, I think if it's possible, I think moving to that kind of a direction would be really ideal. I think it probably would be easier to do with younger children without having to deal with like teenagers being frustrating sometimes, to say the least. But yeah, I think especially with young children, thinking about the different ways you could divide them up just for fun activities, and really thinking about the time when you do need to divide them up, what is it that you're actually dividing them up on? Thinking back to our language, is that space sex segregated? So does it really matter what their bodies look like, or is it about their gender and how they're presenting themselves and know themselves? If your determination is sex segregation is what it has to be, then it's going to be really hard for you to build a gender-inclusive, trans-inclusive space. If it's a gender-inclusive one, then that opens up a lot more room for folks to go with the group that's affirmative of who they are rather than what their body looks like, because it's very private and not really needed for many of the programs that we're doing. Oh, and one thing I didn't touch on that I did want to talk about was swimming. So how to navigate and balance swim time with gender and expression can be really challenging. I think, just to be very honest and blunt with folks, because I think what people are afraid of is a trans girl who has a male body coming in what they would imagine a little girl would want to wear for a bathing suit and being able to see the indentation of a penis at swim time. I will tell you that that probably is not going to happen. From my experience, not all trans folks have gender dysphoria, but many trans folks, in my experience, have some issues with their body, or at least very private, and don't want to expose themselves in that way. And so I would go on a limb and say that a young trans girl is going to wear a bathing suit that's going to keep from sight parts of her body that she might not be wanting to see. And the same kind of on the reverse, a trans boy who maybe has a female, was assigned female at birth, is probably not going to wear a one piece, or like a swimming trunks. They'll probably wear a swim shirt. So making sure that your policies allow for swimming shirts and things like that would be really important. That is one misconception that I want to break down, is that many trans folks, particularly young people, are going to be pretty modest, and they're not going to want to be very showy with their body and want to change privately, not going to drop trowel in public. So that is one other thing that I wanted to lift up that I forgot to add. So other questions?
I don't see any.
Okay.
Okay.
And so if there's no other questions, like I said, please feel free to email me if you want to talk more one-on-one. Happy to talk to folks on the phone or just through email. But I just want to thank you all again for sitting in today, and I wish you the best of luck over your summer. And if anything comes up, please be in touch.
So thank you, Daniel, for giving us some really great information to think about. For a complete list of our upcoming webinars and trainings, you can go to jcca.org. If you know others who would be interested in watching this webinar, it has been recorded and it can be found on jcca.me. If you have any questions about our professional development and webinar series, you can email me, Ellen Gettinger. It's egettinger@jcca.org. And we just want to thank you for participating, and thank you, Daniel, for leading this really informative session.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks.